Welcome to CyberSavvy. This podcast was created by DTC to bring awareness, mitigation, and response to cybersecurity threats companies and organizations face daily. Be prepared. Be cybersavvy. Good morning. I'm Andrew Rose, your host for the DTC CyberSavvy podcast. And as our lawyer listeners know, we invite subject matter experts to join us to offer us new and novel ways to protect your organization against the threat of cyber thieves and other malcontents. A little bit about who DTC is. For decades, we've been servicing and protecting the computers and networks of our clients, particularly those in the specialty medical and dental fields. And we're known throughout the industry for how nice our staff is. And I believe we have just celebrated our 25th anniversary, if I recall seeing the LinkedIn post recently. That's phenomenal. One way we do give back to the community is by hosting informational seminars on a variety of topics. And recently, two of our engineers spoke to a group of dental professionals about some cybersecurity risks. And today, I'm joined by Scott Leister. Scott, you've been on this podcast before, but I'm sure there's a few listeners out there who are not as familiar with you. Can you talk a little about what your background is and how long you've been with DTC? And right now, what is your current area of interest?
Well, my background consists of about 20 plus years in the MSP industry, working at DTC, which we primarily focused on dental all that time, although now we're branching into other verticals as well. My current interests are automation. I love just being able to automate repetitive processes. The use of AI and security is a big thing. I have a deep interest in security just because of how important it is to everybody, not only businesses, but personal lives as well.
Now, I know we're going to talk more about the dental presentation that you gave, but can you describe some of the other industries that DTC is branching out into?
Yeah, we're looking to get into a little bit of the financial. We are into some of the manufacturing and also some of the government spaces too. We're starting to explore. That's just a couple of the things, as well as transportation is another one that we're currently in.
Nice. Well, you and Kevin recently gave a presentation to a group of dentists, and Kevin McNamara is another one of our engineers. And you focused on both cybersecurity, but also patient information, which is critical for healthcare providers to maintain a secure presence with that. And you started your presentation with just reviewing some of the main threats that are facing medical professionals today. Can you briefly describe each one of these threats, and as well as add anything that you've thought about since your presentation that you would have liked to include it then as well?
Yeah, pretty much I focus mainly on the threat side as social engineering. That seems like the primary threat. And basically what that is, it's just the presentation of like phishing attacks, be it an email, a phone call, a text, that seems legitimate, that most people run across every day in their lives, that it doesn't look out of the ordinary. So they're emulating stuff that people see regularly, and they're just trained to accept that, like a UPS shipment or a FedEx shipment or something along those lines, that people will click the link and then the bad stuff happens. Other things that we talk about are ransomware. Obviously, that's always the big scary thing. Password cracks and password attacks, lack of multi-factor authentication and weak passwords, and also just like other stuff like the old traditional malware, which is in the form of like Trojan horses, stuff that just resides on your system, just waiting to launch another software or for someone to use. There's keystroke stealers that get installed that will just copy what keystrokes are going in, and they use that for password stealing. And then another one that's been really recent here that we've seen a lot of is like token theft from browsers. Software goes in and steals that, and basically what a token is it's just an authentication token that once you have that, it bypasses all forms of authentication because that indicates that you're already authenticated to what you're doing. So they don't need passwords and multi-factor authentication. So those are some of the key things that we highlight and discuss.
Well, it's certainly a scary universe, and I'm familiar with the social engineering attacks quite a bit. And one of the things, in addition to your UPS, your FedEx, your bank, is they employ a sense of urgency. So if they've got your text number, they'll send you a series of texts one after the other. And as a human being, we're conditioned to respond to that persistent tapping on the door. So it could be a persistence of emails or text messages, or sometimes even phone calls where they'll emulate the voice of someone else. I read a statistic recently that the social engineering attacks, many of them are romance involved, and the average romance attack results in a $10,000 theft. So whoever thinks their new mate requests money for a child that might need surgery or something like that. But on average, the amount of money that's stolen is $10,000. This is a wide array of threats that are facing medical professionals and their employees. Scott, what are some of the things that reasonable people can do to mitigate against these types of threats?
Yeah, well, that's a great question because it is a scary landscape out there. And the number one thing that I stress is just education, user education. There are programs out there that can do phishing simulations that emulate a lot of these attacks and these social engineering attacks that you see. And then also like just cybersecurity training in general, just different trainings. And they're not a huge time commitment. Usually it's like 5-10 minutes at a shot. But what it does is it clues you into the different types of threats that are out there and what to look for, be it link embedding or email address spoofing, where they might use a familiar name, but you can find out what the actual sender email address is. And to me, that's the big thing. And then the other thing is multi-factor authentication. If it's available, use it, because that just adds another layer of authentication on top that makes it more difficult to gain access. There's other things we talk about is zero trust policies, which in the past, security was always trust but verify, but apparently that has not worked. And so now you have to do the zero trust, which you don't trust anybody to do anything, and they must prove that they need access to something before it is granted. Other things, the standard type of stuff, run like your software updates, your operating system critical security updates, run like an endpoint security. Antivirus just isn't enough anymore. You need some of the more advanced tools like endpoint detection and response, and even managed detection and response, which usually has like a security center behind it monitoring for activity and threats. And then obviously like network security for firewalls, blocking any incoming traffic. Basically data encryption's another good one too.
Oh, absolutely. And I've heard recently that there are still a lot of people out there that will use the same password for multiple accounts. And I know password management can be burdensome. And I've seen even NIST, that is one of the standards arbitrators in the federal government, has come out and said that every company should allow passwords to be at least 64 characters now. And I know that there's some organizations that even I use for my financial purposes that don't allow longer passwords like that. What are your thoughts on passwords in general, and maybe some of the new guidance as well?
Yeah, well, that's great. My thoughts on passwords are number one is length is the most important thing. You had indicated like 64 characters is a good standard, which it is, because, a simplified sentence that is 32 characters long is far more secure than a 10-letter or 10-character complex password, but just due to the time it takes to crack that with current technology. Another thing on passwords that I strongly encourage is using a password manager. Because when you have multiple sites, because everything's in the cloud, everything is online, and multiple sites and multiple passwords, and instead of using the same password for every site, and when you're forced to change a lot sometimes on these, is to help remember them is you make them simplified, where you might do something like password 1 on one account, password 2 on another account, or something that is familiar to you, like child's birthday or your favorite vacation spot or something along those lines, which is a lot of that stuff is easily accessible or found out through social media stuff. So what the password manager does is it allows you to create one long complex password that you have to remember. And that's just to access the password manager. And then anytime you go into a site, you can create a random generated long password that is unique to that site, and the password manager will remember that and allow you to log in using that. To me, that is a huge thing. And I always definitely mention that on password managers. And then just like I mentioned earlier, multi-factor authentication. If it's available to you, then use it. Like the randomly generated codes, any biometrics, anything along those lines are going to be your strongest. SMS, which is like a text, or email, they're okay. They're a little weaker because they can be cracked a little easier, but any kind of multi-factor authentication on any account, I strongly recommend.
And along those lines, I'm familiar with the Google Password Manager that stores everything there. And I think just as a general listener, they might say, okay, that sounds very convenient, but what if the password manager gets hacked? What kind of peril am I in at that point? So just a question for you, and you don't have to respond with any particular platforms out there that you would recommend, but is the Google Password Manager adequate in what it does, or would you recommend something even more robust than that?
I would recommend something more robust. Most of the password managers that are commercial that you have to buy are a few dollars a month. And they're portable, so they can work on your cell phone, they can work on a computer, a web browser, a tablet, anything that has allows you to either download an app or put a browser extension in there. And they're going to be a lot more robust, and you can even do like the multi-factor authentication through those password managers as well, just to cut out the extra access if it's something that is not hyper secure, or it's better than using an email or a text message as the backup for multi-factor authentication, because that'll use the randomly generated ones. And to your previous question about the password managers being hacked, it happens. I know there was a very popular one that I had used that had been compromised, and that was actually just poor design by the company that had that, where they stored decryption keys in the same location as the backups. So once that got breached, they had access to everything. So that's kind of like a one-off. It's not something you hear of often, but it does happen. And if you hear of anything along those lines, then definitely go in and regenerate your passwords for any sites that may have been compromised. And a lot of the password managers too, also the commercial ones, will do like the dark web monitoring for you, where they'll actually indicate within the manager itself that your password may have been compromised in a specific breach or something, and they will recommend you to go in and change that password. Or they'll also let you know that any sites that you have, the passwords are weak and you should change it and generate a long random password that the manager will maintain for you.
Wow. And going back to what you said a little bit ago, just for a couple of dollars a month to protect your most critical crown jewels of your organization, for me, that's almost a no-brainer to have an upgraded password manager. And not that it's good that anyone gets hacked and stuff like that, but if a password manager gets hacked, every other password manager platform out there is going to see how it got hacked, and they're going to ensure that they protected themselves against that type of threat. And I'm sure the one that was hacked, if it's still viable, is now much more secure than it was prior to that too. So not to wish ill, but hopefully they've learned from their mistakes. Another question for you. I do a lot of work in the agricultural community, and one thing that we find there is folks will often have the same router for their business as well as their personal use. I don't know if that is the same that you're seeing in the medical industry or not, but could you comment on how important it is not to have a shared router for family as well as business?
Yeah, certainly. You definitely want to segregate any kind of traffic out your business. Even if you have wireless in your business, that should be on a separate network to what your local is. Anything to restrict access. And you definitely want a business grade firewall for your business, because that's the livelihood right there, like all the crucial information. And usually the commercials are going to give you a lot more protection and a lot more control over data coming in and out. And plus, they're going to generate a lot more updates that's managed too, that can be applied if there's like a security flaw or something along those lines that can be done, which you just don't see that on like the home side. And that's mostly a lot of that stuff is set it and forget it. Although you should go in and change default passwords on any device that you buy. But yeah, definitely you always want to segregate any kind of business firewall or router from just basic home, what you would use in your home.
Yeah, and you touched on something that we could spend an entire hour talking about, and that's the entire device management. You mentioned change the password on any device that you have connected to the internet, and I would venture to think there are some listeners out there that had devices plugged into the internet that password hasn't been changed. And I've heard stories, and whether these are anecdotal or true, that some thieves will go out there to the user manual for some of these devices and then try the default password that comes with the device, and lo and behold are able to get into people's networks using that. And common sense, if you're a business owner and you're just starting out there, make the investment to get a business router, get the commercial firewall in there. I can't stress that enough. And in the medical professional world, it might not be as prevalent, but I'm seeing in a lot of the small businesses out there, especially those that are home-based or moving out of their home, are using that one router. And it terrifies me that that could be an open network for adversaries to get into. Scott, any last feelings about that as well? Because this is something I'm passionate about.
Yeah, it's just you want to secure everything as best as possible. And sometimes you have to spend a little bit more to get the proper tools to protect yourself. And even home, you never want to just plug and play a router or modem or wireless or anything. Always change passwords, always make access as difficult as possible. And that's the beauty of like commercial equipment is if it's managed, then who's ever managing it has that burden on them to do it. And most companies will do that for you, or they'll make access as difficult as possible for anybody outside of who should have access.
Yeah, the proactive threat monitoring. There's a lot of folks out there that are more in a reactive stance, but having a commercial account, that's another benefit. I think I told this story on an earlier podcast, but I ran across a business owner who had their home compromised, their home router compromised, which was linked to their restaurant. The restaurant got compromised. The restaurant was linked to their production facility, and that got compromised. But just another case point of making sure that you've got some sort of segmentation between your personal and your professional routers out there. Scott, in the old days, we used to have the saying, it's not if, it's when you'll be attacked. And right now, the new saying, it's not when, it's again. The persistence of the ransomware, the malware, the keystroke loggers, it's inevitable, well, knock on wood, it's pretty much inevitable that a business will be the subject of a cyber attack. And when that happens, then there's a response mechanism. And oftentimes that is not only IT, but insurance as well. And I know that you covered insurance when you're giving your presentation to the dental professionals. Can you talk a little bit about how you and DTC work hand in hand with insurance companies, not only after an attack, but those assessments before a client engages an insurance company?
Yeah, certainly. We strongly recommend, almost to the point of requiring our clients to have cyber liability insurance. And what that does is obviously that financially protects you in the event of a security event. And how we interact with them is our very first response when an incident occurs is to inform the client to contact their cyber liability insurance and just open a case, not indicating that anything is going to come of it. But the sooner that you open that case, the more responsive and the quicker it will be, and the less chance that anything will be denied if by waiting too long just to see if anything bad happens down the line. It's a proactive stance on trying to remediate anything that might have happened. And basically what we will do is we will give access to whomever is doing the forensics because most of the insurance companies will have like a forensics team that they deal with. And what we will do is give them access to it. We'll provide any kind of logs or information or specific access that they need to get into the network to try to investigate what may or may not have happened. And sometimes they will actually install their own software that will just scan the network and monitor the devices and check it out for anything that's running. And basically what we do is then we become just an assistant to that process. And then we kind of wait. So the cyber liability insurance really drives that forensics piece of it. And then we just assist as we can.
So some of our listeners, I'm sure, will be getting their new premiums or their new requirements to even have cyber liability insurance. And I know that DTC will often work with their clients to ensure the checklists are complete. What are some of the main things on these checklists that you see that a business professional should focus on to ensure they have a frictionless renewal for their cyber liability?
The primary things that I see on the forms are multi-factor authentication is heavily listed. That's a major requirement. And that's multi-factor authentication for any kind of remote access. They want to make sure that you are using a secure access. A lot of them will specify a VPN. We don't really use VPNs anymore just because they can be insecure. And some of the ones can be a little difficult to set up multi-factor authentication on. So we'll do like a zero trust, which we use another third party to authenticate. Another thing is email access. What's the email access like outside of the office? Do your employees have access to the email 24/7? And is that email set with multi-factor authentication? And then a lot of the standard stuff, like do you have backups that are on site and in the cloud, and are they encrypted? Have you tested your backup to make sure that it's good? Then the standard stuff, like what do you use for your endpoint detection? Do you have a business grade firewall? Those kind of questions. And then as far as like the AV and stuff, they want to make sure that you're actually using a business grade AV as well, something that's managed and is verified that it's updated and set to scan and is monitored.
Did you say AV?
Yeah, I'm sorry, antivirus. That's the old school antivirus.
I was thinking the AV club from high school. Yeah, those are all, I hesitate to say basic, but they're also critical. And I think that business owners a lot of times are focused on doing what they do best. And these types of resilience, these types of things, the MFA was just one of those that 2 years ago, I believe it was, the CISA came out and said MFA everything. And if you do that, you reduce your attack surface by 98%. Whether that's an accurate percentage or not, it is critical. And it's one of the things that really is heartening to me, just as a consumer, is the availability of MFA on places where your social media sites and other places like that, where in the past it hadn't been as common. But due to a lot of the social engineering attacks that you mentioned early on and people's accounts getting taken over, it's a very, very safe way to do it. And Scott, you and I probably remember those days when passwords were 4 characters long. You know, we will never go back to that point in time unless there's some sort of biometric chip that's embedded in us that is only good for us.
Yeah, I agree. I remember back in the days in like Windows 98 where there were no passwords.
Oh, gosh. This is the part of the podcast I'm really looking forward to because I unfortunately was unable to be at your CE presentation. I'm curious, what were some of the questions and comments or concerns or things that the doctor shared with you after your presentation that you found enlightening?
Probably the primary questions that we get are around the cyber liability insurance, like what they look for, what's the amount they're covering, what are the hurdles, why should I have it, that kind of stuff. We do get that. And then a lot of times I will specify specific things, like I mentioned the password managers before. And another big one that I highly recommend is just like ad blockers in like computer browsers and stuff that just block the pop-up ads or the ads you see when you just use a Google search. So I get a lot of questions around those as to what's good, how do you access it, how do you install it, what's the cost, those kind of things. And then other things are, we get a little bit of the generic stuff about, well, how do I recognize that an email is phishing, or like how do I make sure that I can protect my data but still have remote access, and why should I not use a VPN? Those kinds of questions.
Yes, and so much there. But let's go back to that VPN for a minute too, because I do remember it wasn't too long ago, 4 or 5 years ago, when that was the gold standard of internet security. From a technical standpoint, what happened? Why has that changed?
Well, the problem with the VPN is if it's set up correctly, it can still be a viable remote access solution. The problem is that when you create a VPN, is whatever device you are connecting from, and most times it's a home computer or something that's unsecured or not monitored. And what that does is now that puts that device on your business's network. So now anything that is happening to that computer can spread across the VPN over into your network. So it now puts your business network at risk just by adding an unknown device into it. And plus, the other thing I mentioned earlier was that some of the VPNs, the traditional VPNs, are a little difficult to add MFA to. If you're using just a VPN through, say, like a regular firewall or something along those lines, a lot of times you have to set up a complicated third-party service that can be expensive and difficult to manage to enable a multi-factor authentication. And so without that, and then plus weak passwords. So once, if your password's cracked, then a lot of times it's just a username and a password. And once they have that, then they have access to the keys to the kingdom, because once you're in on a VPN, is generally you have access to the entire network.
Okay, good. Well, I appreciate your framing on that one, because I had thought that maybe there was a flaw in the whole VPN schema rather than endpoint user issue. Okay. And then another question, you mentioned that a lot of the docs were commenting on the cyber liability. Were they commenting? I mean, I'm assuming they understand that it's a given now, that it's really almost impossible to operate a business at their level without having that kind of protection. What were some of the questions about? Where was it about cost? Was it about complexity? Give me a little bit of framing on that.
Well, some of it is what are the requirements? I mean, we briefly go over, but they may specify like specific things like, do I need this? And I have this. Is this sufficient enough? Type of thing. And another thing that we do mention that Kevin always brings up is using a commercial grade email address, a business email service, instead of just like the free Gmail or something like that, because of the controls and stuff are a little more robust, that you can lock that down and then plus enable like multi-factor authentication and stuff like that. So that's most of the questions are like, what do I need and how much is it? We don't get too much on how much is it going to cost us. We do get some on, well, how much can I get cyber liability insurance for? And then that answer, usually we say that's up to the whoever is providing the insurance, whoever the broker is, and what they will allow. It's like, just because you want $10 million of coverage doesn't mean you're going to get $10 million of coverage. A lot of times it's capped off at like a certain amount. And then plus, based on your answers and how you're evaluated through the questionnaires and stuff, then that can affect your rate and the amount of coverage that you can get as well.
Yeah, and there are trusted partners within the medical community that provide that sort of risk management, both in policies and advice. And we certainly recommend that you reach out to us for recommendations or reach out to your provider and just ensure that you've got adequate cyber liability insurance. There's a lot of folks out there that I feel are either undercovered or have opted out or have an assumption that cyber insurance will be the firewall they need to protect them against adversaries. And it's a lot more complicated than that. And it's an area that is changing rapidly too because of the amount of attacks that are happening. One little bit of advice that I've heard from many insurance providers is whatever cyber liability insurance you get, keep it printed off your network. Cyber thieves for years, that is one of the top prizes they go for. If they understand what your liability coverage is, that's going to be the exact amount they demand if they exploit a ransomware attack on your systems. So it's again, it's a brave, scary new world out there. Scott, we've covered a lot of ground here, and I'm sure since you gave that presentation, there are a few other things that you thought of that you wish you had gone deeper in or talked about. As we close out the podcast here, what are some of those things that you would like to share to the medical community about how to better mitigate and respond to some of these cyber attacks?
Yeah. So I will stress, and usually what I state is that for good security posture is you need three things. You need time, you need effort, and unfortunately you need money. There are ways to do that without spending a ton of money, but it still takes vigilance against these types of threats. And I can never stress enough, like just end user education, just to help identify some of what these threats are. Because, like I said, the bulk of this stuff comes through some kind of phishing attack, and that's the easiest way in. Because the human is the unknown element in there. And other things that I would like to just stress on that generally I don't go too deep into, I will mention is I stated earlier about like other than just antivirus running more advanced endpoint tools like endpoint detection and response, and also managed detection and response. And basically what those are is those are services that have like some kind of AI or automation or actual human beings in the background looking at information on the network and your endpoints like computers and such, that what is going on. Because in the old days, like ransomware used to be like they get access and they just blast the ransomware. Well, that's not really the case anymore because cybercrime has become really specialized. It's a business like any other thing. And so you have like access brokers now that what they'll do is they'll gain access to a network and plant some kind of seed or Trojan or some way that they can gain future access, be it like credentials or a new user or something along those lines. And then what they'll do is they'll sell that access. And then once that access is purchased, then somebody else will come in and they just don't blast malicious software because a lot of the detection tools have got so advanced that they use something that is termed as living off the land. So they use existing tools, existing built-in functions of the operating system to move around the network. And that's where like the managed detection and response and the endpoint detection and response really comes into play because it looks for unnatural lateral movement or it looks for like the creation of a new admin account, or it looks for patterns that are abnormal to what's normally generated on a system. Like we had one that it was a tool that was used to scan the network and it got flagged because it was using a built-in default account to scan the network. And our security company noticed that and said like somebody's moving across the network laterally. And it wasn't like any malicious tool or anything. It was just a network scan. And so the advanced methods that those tools allow you to utilize against, like I said, the threats that are living off the land that are not using any kind of malicious software or anything. So that's something that I generally do not discuss too much in detail. I may mention it a little bit, but that's something that more than just running an antivirus or going up and getting the free one or using a built-in unmanaged antivirus or something along those lines. It's like, unfortunately, that's the name of the game these days is you have to pay to play.
Yeah, exactly. And just I'm sitting back here thinking about all those attacks, all those things that DTC and you and the rest of the team mitigate against that the clients don't ever see. You know, all these penetrations that were thwarted. I mean, you guys are heroes every day. And sometimes I don't think that's recognized as much as it should be. And thankfully, you are out there protecting and servicing the medical and dental professional world. So, Scott, I certainly tip my hat at you, and hopefully, somebody buys you a good cup of coffee today for all your efforts.
Oh, thanks.
Well, listen, this is my second to last podcast as your host. We will be passing the torch to Mike Sheila. So, on our next podcast, we will do an introduction to Mike and all things about him. I've known him for probably almost 20 years. So, I'll have a whole pocket full of stories to share and get his inputs and insights on quite a few things. And to all you loyal listeners who've grown accustomed to my voice, I will see you out there in the Netherlands and Etherlands or Netherlands, however you want to say it. And Mike's got a heck of a voice too, so I think you'll appreciate everything he's got to share. Should you be listening to this and need immediate attention or just want to inquire about DTC services, please visit our website at www.dtctoday.com and reach out. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you very much. We would love to hear from you. Please email us your questions or comments to askus@dtctoday.com. New episodes of CyberSavvy are posted the second Tuesday of every month. For more detailed information, visit our website at dtctoday.com. Be prepared. Be cybersavvy.